The following San Francisco IGDA event was recorded on June 1st, 2016 at Dolby Labs in San Francisco. Our speaker began his career at Rainbow Studios creating console games for PlayStation 2 and Xbox. After that, he worked for 10 years at Dreamworks Animation before founding Misfits Attic, where he created the video games A Virus Named Tom and Duskers. We invite you to enjoy a fireside chat with Tim Keenan.
Thank you so much for speaking, and also congratulations with Duskers that you shipped two weeks ago.
Yep.
That's awesome.
It is awesome, and it's horrible. Like, shipping is tough.
Why horrible?
It's just that's the time when you, like, the crunch happens, and then you have to, like, hawk your wares, and so you start to feel kind of, I don't know, it's always weird when you're like, I made this awesome thing, but I have to convince everybody it's awesome.
Right.
Like, that's, like, I would love it if everyone would just recognize how awesome my shit was. That would be so much easier.
Just get it.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, right? So it can be kind of rough. And I had this clever tweet, which I rarely have, where I was like, it's not that it takes me 3 years to make a game. It takes me 3 years to, like, be willing to launch a game again. Because it's such a pain. And then, there's all the different, getting everything ready for the store page and getting everything right and timing all your gobbledygook and your marketing and your PR and all that stuff. It'd be better if I had, like, people that did more things. I actually do have people, but I don't have enough people, apparently.
Yeah.
Need more people.
Yeah. But you've gotten some pretty good press coverage. I read the article on Wired, which... a lot of people really, because this game is so different from everything else out there, they're really, the people who are covering it are really emphasizing a lot of the key points of the game and how, immersive it is and how innovative it is. So I sort of feel like the coverage has been, you haven't had a ton of coverage, but there's probably a lot of opportunity to kind of keep going with that, right?
Yeah, no, all the coverage we've gotten, it's kind of weird when you try to do something artistically or creatively, and, like, I feel like either I'm a crappy creator or this is just the way that it is, but, like, rarely do people come back to you and they regurgitate, like, what you wanted them to feel.
Right.
You're like, I want you to feel, like, isolated and, like, this technology is, like, in your way but helping you and, like, all this stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then usually it works out that you tell them. You're like, oh, I wanted you to feel this, and they nod and they're like, oh, I totally felt like that. But very rarely do they, like, come to you with that. Right. And I feel like with Duskers, I feel like we went, like, really hard at that, and I was pretty sure that we wouldn't achieve that. And I feel like we did. Because, right. Like, the rock, paper, shotgun, the Wired, the kill screen, like, all those things... It wasn't like, oh, this is this and this is that. Like, they all got it. They really got it.
Yeah.
And I was listening to a podcast that Quentin Smith that did Shut Up and Sit Down, which is, like, the board game podcast. They have, like, a thing called Cool Ghosts now. And him and Matt Lees were talking about it. And it's just crazy. I feel like so many times you'll, like, read the forums or you'll read things about your game. And you'll just be like, you don't get this or you don't get that. And, like, I feel like with all of those... They totally get it. Mm-hmm. Now, I think what that might be is there's, like, a selection process that is the willingness to play a game with a command line interface, with, like, screenshots like we have. That's really weird, right? Mm-hmm. So I feel like that's the beauty of making, like, a niche game, is that, like, it's self-selecting in a way. So, like, the people who like the game, like, love the game. Mm-hmm. And the people who are like, I don't know about that, they don't bother. Mm-hmm. It's the same thing with the price point. Like, it's $20. So I feel like that keeps... the riff-raff at bay,
Yeah.
Like, you're kind of like, I mean, it's insane, $20, but, like, it's like that. I think that's a big decision point for people.
Yeah.
So that, like, keeps our, whatever, 95% positive or whatever on Steam. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think we made a good game, but I also think we're not, like, if the game was $2.99, we get a lot of people be like, I'll try it, and they'd be like, this is stupid, you can't use the mouse right now, so thumbs down,
Yeah, that was. I remember talking to you about that while your game was in development, about the interface, and you must have, like, did you go back and forth on that? Did you sort of say, well, maybe I should give an option for that?
Right. So it's really funny because how the command line came to be is like in question, because I was at like a TIG jam, and it's between Ian Stalker or Alex Austin or myself. I don't know who. So it might have been me in my mind, because both of them claim they didn't do this, but they were like playing the early demo, which was like 1-2 days in, and they were like, this would be so cool with a command line. And I was like, and you know, at first I laughed. I was just like, yeah, okay, more feedback, like that's what I need. And then all of a sudden, like I stopped, and like I feel like every decision in this game has been like that, where at first I laugh at it and I'm like, that's ridiculous, and then I stop and I'm like, wait, that would actually be awesome. And actually, once we put the command line in, so then I took the command line around, because yes, I was like, this is a really bad idea, right? So I took it to all my dev friends, and they were all like, basically, yeah, it's a really bad idea. But the way they would say it is they would play the game, and they'd be like, wow, I really like the command line. You should totally take this out of the game. And it was like, I like it, but they won't, right? Like, it's like, and it's also a scary thing to put something like that in a game and like immediately like destroy a giant swath of your potential audience, right? Because especially coming from DreamWorks, I was used to making these movies, and it's like, you want it to appeal to the 4-year-old, you want it to appeal to mom, you want it to grandma, you want like, you know, you're making Shrek, you're like, let's make sure that like there's some funny jokes in this, but like there's like for adult sensibilities, but like the kids will like it because of this, and that's the mentality. And then once. Actually, after A Virus Named Tom, Holly and I sat down and we were kind of going over things, because that was our first game.
So who's Holly, just for the
sorry.
record?
So Holly is my wife, who actually our first game was A Virus Named Tom, which was an action puzzle game, and then my wife actually did a lot of the artwork for that, because that makes it free. And and she's also a very talented artist, like graphic designer. So it was like perfect. I was like, oh my god, you can like games, especially puzzle games, are kind of a UI. Like the art is, you're interacting with it, so it's got to be usable.
Right.
So that all worked out. And at the end of A Virus Named Tom, which we had originally designed for console, and then PC was just so much easier. And ironically, we made it in XNA, which is like Microsoft's free engine, and ended up putting it out on like Sony products, on like the Vita and stuff like that, which just shows you how weird the world can be. But we kind of thought about it, and we were like, okay, on this game, what did we do? Like, we made a co-op game, you know, and it was local, because online would have taken a lot more work, and it's like not a lot of people on PC playing local co-op, not a lot of people on even consoles playing a lot of local co-op. And then it had a finite amount of hours to it, you know. It was like, if you went through it and beat it, it would be like it's 8 hours or whatever, and then your name isn't popping up on Steam showing all your friends that you're playing it. And there were like a couple things that we were like, all right, this isn't perfect for like a PC audience. So that's when we started being like, all right, let's do procedural generation, because that'll allow us to have like way more hours, and like let's really appeal to like a more core audience. And we were looking at it, and we were like, nowadays, with the volume of games out there, I feel like it used to be that you could be like, I'm going to make an awesome platformer. And because it's awesome, that'll be fine. And nowadays, maybe you can do that, but I mean, by awesome, you're talking like, you're going to have to go like, now you're going to have to go like Ori and the Blind Forest, right? It's like not something easy for like that level of polish from like a, 2-3 man team or whatever. So we were like, how do we maximize all of this stuff? So that was one of the things, was like procedural generation. And we also were like, we don't want to try to appeal to everyone, because then we're competing with EA or whoever that can do that better than us, because they have a larger team. Like, we want to go after, like, for us, like, EA can't go after something that's, going to make 50,000 sales. You know what I mean? That's just not going to support a studio. But, like, we can. So that's when all of a sudden we say command line interface. Maybe there are enough people out there that, like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it's funny, because once we made that, my favorite thing in the game actually was when we made that decision. Because once we made that decision, I could make any decision I wanted. Because it was like, my analogy is always like, we had already stolen the car. It's like, what are we going to not speed now? Are we going to not do coke now? Are we going to like, not, like, you know what I mean? Like way back then, if we were going to be like, oh, we want to appeal to a mass audience, we're already down that road. So we might as well just keep going.
Yeah. Yeah, well, one of the things that I felt playing it, and I haven't spent too long playing it because super busy, but I played it in sort of preparing for this, and I played it before. But in preparing for this, it's different playing a game that's in development and a game that's done.
Mm-hmm.
But the biggest effect that I had playing this now was just how immersive the command line interface is. Just how much you feel like you are on the bridge of the ship and controlling things. And once you get those headphones on, you listen to the sound design. And you kind of get in that mode, just how instantly that affects you and makes you feel that you're taken away, that you're in that world. So when you talk about like how you what effect that had on maybe like the story and how you thought about the narrative and that kind of part of it.
Yeah, well, so all the stuff that went into making that feel immersive, it's just like anything when I used to work on like films and stuff like that. They're like, someone knows the difference between like a very pretty film and something that was like kind of thrown together.
Mm-hmm.
And they can't point out exactly why, but they know it, right? And so like a lot of little decisions I feel went into that. And I was really amazed. My favorite story is I was hanging out with a buddy of mine at GDC who I didn't even know played the game. And he was telling me that like he would turn on the monitor and put his headphones down and he would walk up his stairs. He was in his basement. He would put it's in his basement. And then he would turn around, he would open up the door and like walk down into the cockpit of his ship and like be there.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I feel that we did, and again, this was another one of these decisions that like being incredibly stubborn sometimes pays off. Like at the very beginning of Duskers, we were having trouble letting people know that they were the drone operator. Because they'd see the drone and they're like, oh, I'm the drone. I move around the drone. And then they'd see multiple drones. They're like, oh, it's a party of drones. It's an RPG, right? Like, here's the tank, and this is area control, and we're good, right? And, like, I'm in God mode, like I am in a lot of games. And it's like, no, you're the drone operator. Like, your keyboard is your keyboard, and your monitor is your monitor. And a lot of people wanted me to do, like, a scene where you see this bed of monitors like you get in Aliens, right? When Gorman's behind and Ripley's back there, and you're seeing the staticky images from the Marines. And that's how I kind of pictured it. And they were like, oh, show that. And then they sit down and then zoom in on one, and that gives them context. And that would have worked. But then I didn't like it because at that point, I wasn't the operator.
Right.
I was the guy playing the operator. And I didn't want that. And it needed to be one-to-one, your screen to it.
Yep.
And that's when we started doing things like the opening boot screen. Like where all of a sudden you see everything go by and you're like, oh, like this is my computer that's doing this. And there was like a lot of little ways that we started adding into that. And it took a while. It took a year to get there. But now when people talk about it, it's kind of amazing because they're like, everyone says like, turn off the lights, put your headphones on, and like imagine that glowing screen is your monitor and you're in a ship. And actually there was someone that was writing, he was in a hotel room and there was like some construction going on. And he was like freaking out because he didn't know like what was the construction and what was like in the earphones. And and then he was like trying to sleep and he was like still hearing noises. And it's just like, but so obviously all that feeds into all that kind of comes from the story and the atmosphere.
Right.
Because at the very beginning of the game, we were going to make it much more like a sort of Cowboy Bebop, like or like a Han Solo and Chewie kind of thing where it's like, you owe some people some money, they want it from you, and you've got this quick get-rich-quick scheme that you're going to like go and basically into the Bermuda Triangle of space and like salvage stuff to try and make enough money. And when we were driving through with these drones, even at the very beginning it was just a box and headlights, the game was creepy and it was tense, especially because I wanted that motion sensor sort of thing. And it just didn't feel right. I was just like, this game is too like dark and somber for this kind of buddy picture kind of thing that we were doing. And so it all kind of came from that. And like the story that would make sense, I realized I was actually on a plane with another dev and he was like, what about like zombies in space? And I was just like, oh my God, no, don't, like, you're not saying this to me. And then I was like, wait a minute. imagine all the zombie movies that you like and how much better they would be if there weren't zombies in them. Right? Now do the same thing, right? Like, he was right. Like, everything needed to be dead.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're creeping through, and we also didn't have like the budget to like put all these like bones and skeletons and like have tapes playing and all this stuff, you know?
Right.
And I was just like, what if there was no one there? And would it be even creepier if there weren't any bodies?
Mm-hmm.
It would. I mean, it's just like Jaws, right? It's just like, it's creepier not knowing. So that's where the story all came from. It was like, it makes total sense that this person is alone and they're trying to find anyone else. And that fits so well into the vibe that I already had, that I was working toward, which was how like technology can really isolate and alienate you. Like it's like, it enables you. Like, I can do all these amazing things with technology, but it also kind of removes me from those things. And forcing you through the command line was a way of saying, you have to speak to that drone the way that drone wants to be spoken to.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not, like, you're not talking to a person. And when you look through, originally the camera view was like a security camera.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was like, no, that's like how we see the world, right? Like, I want it to be, so we did that slam imagery thing where you're seeing all these points on the edges, because that's the way it sees it. So I wanted everything to be like, you know, there's a beep of the motion sensor, and you're like, something's moving in there. What is it? I don't know. We don't have that fidelity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like the technology is letting you know that there's something in that room, but it's not telling you what. And it, you know, and it doesn't feel one way or the other about that.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like, something's moving. You know, it might be a cat, or it might be something that's going to eat your face, you know?
Yeah.
And so then the story came from that. And I started working with Benjamin Hill over at, who had worked on Ether One. And we had like a really good rapport. And so we just started working out all of these, like, started reading about existential risk, which is like super interesting, like AI singularity, like, you know, nanotechnology, what have you, cosmic event, like, all these different wonderful ways that humanity could be wiped out. And then we were like, how do we convey this story? Actually, one of the hardest things about the story was mechanically, because the game is a roguelike. And I didn't want to do persistence like, I feel like everyone who plays roguelikes, there's this like fulcrum point, and it is Rogue Legacy. I'm really meandering here. And Rogue Legacy is this fulcrum point because like a lot of traditional roguelikes like do not have persistence. And that creates a sense of tension because when you die, you lose everything. However, it's not that bad because when you start again, every procedurally generated, everything's going to be different. And you can start fresh. You don't have to worry about like if you screwed up at the beginning of the last one. Mm-hmm. And then Rogue Legacy, what that does is it allows you some persistence. You get to keep your gold, so then you can kind of, you know, buy new things and then make the next run easier. Mm-hmm. Which a lot of roguelike enthusiasts, like a lot of people love that and a lot of people hate that. And I was on the side of the fence that it takes away tension and it adds a grind. So I was like, I didn't want to have persistence, but then how do you tell? I was on two sides of this thing. There's the player story, which is awesome. That's like, I had my drones and like I accidentally like opened up the airlock and, you know, Tommy died, you know? And then there's like the crafted story, you know, that you lead a player through, right? Which also can be awesome because in theory, someone who can write really well told it. And that's like the book or the movie, you know, that we kind of make games approximate. Right. And so what I was trying to do was both. Mm-hmm. I was like, I really love the player story. I want this to be procedurally generated, and I don't want the story to feel out of place in that world. But I also don't want to just be like, okay, go to point A to get the next story beat, because your point A is different. Mm-hmm. So we started off by making it that the requirements weren't go to point A. It was like, you know, like this is a military storyline. So the more military ships you find, the more likely you are to find communications between those. And then the other thing that we did was we broke them up into these logs that you would randomly find. And we also made it that you would find them slowly. So that like probably every fourth ship is only when you get a log. Mm-hmm. And when you're playing the game for a long period of time with all the logs it has, it's a real slow moving story, which is how the game is. The game is a very slow moving game. And then the final thing that we did, which I thought was really interesting, was allow all of those logs to be out of order. Some of them had to be in order because it's like, you know, we needed to gate certain things so that like you could progress a storyline of a single thread. But a lot of the supplemental stuff we did out of order. And we had a survey that we put up. And we took, because our theory was, and this is completely not scientific at all, but our theory is that, like, if you read passage A and passage B, and someone else read them in the opposite order, they would perceive that differently. And so we had 2 logs. One of them that talked about a scientist that had found like a dead rat, and he was worried because of the way it was decomposing, right? He was worried that maybe some of the molecular assemblers from the food generators or whatever were going a little haywire because it was like turning into this weird viscous material. And this is like, the Grey Goose scare where like self-replicating nano machines will just keep replicating and making more of themselves. And another log was these 2 kind of, I don't know, I guess like operators that were like, just talking about how they had gotten, like, this one guy was a little worried because he had gotten a message from a scientist about some dead animal. And the other guy's like, dude, like every time a cat dies in space, like, they're like, oh, the molecular assemblers did it and all this stuff, right? And so we then asked at the end of this, like, what do you, like, how much of a concern is this dead rat? And the people that read the scientist first, they were like, this is a big concern. They were more concerned generally. And they also, like, I gave them space to write things, and they generally thought the operators were idiots. Because it was like, here's this guy reporting this thing, and they're just like, don't worry about it, right? And then the people who read it the opposite way, they kind of read, hey, like, there are all these kook scientists that are always sending us these notes. And then you read the scientist, and they're like, oh, that's the kook scientist they were talking about. So they were less concerned, Now, this is not, this is not hard science at all. Because it was like, whatever, like 60 people responded to this thing or whatever. And, there's a million factors. But clearly there was some discrepancy there. And so our hope is that we told a story, and depending on the order that you read it, you will get a different story than the player next to you. Just like your player story in the game is completely different. And also you might go down the, this military path, and the other person first might go down, this, pandemic path. And then, that might affect the way that they view everything. So, yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's cool. Is that recording? I just noticed you're okay. I'm going to cut this part out. So I wanted to talk about sort of how you got started in video games and kind of go back to, why is it that you, like, first of all, like, how did you get your first gig and at Rainbow's, that was your first job, right?
Yeah, so I started in 2001. It was right out of school. I got a job at Rainbow Studios down in Phoenix. And they were working on a game called they were working on Splashdown, which was, a jet ski game for the PlayStation 2, I believe. And then eventually for the Xbox. And then we made a game called ATV Offroad Fury 2. And, we did Mad Hoffman Pro BMX, a bunch of games, basically extreme sports games. That was like kind of like the MO. And I loved working on games. I loved working with the people that I worked with, but they just abused us. Like, I just worked till, 2 in the morning. I remember I was working just nonstop, and I had told my boss at the time, I'm like, my girlfriend is flying in. So, over, the next few days, I'm only going to work, 8 to 10 hours, so that I could actually see her, and I'm actually not going to come in on Saturday, And then I remember the next week being called in by his boss and being castrated for that, just being like, what's going on here? Like, you don't seem like you're putting in the work, And at that point I was like, okay, fuck this.
Yeah.
So I went to film for 10 years.
Yeah.
And I always said to myself, if I was gonna, and I was at DreamWorks, and film can be really bad too, but I find in animation, especially at DreamWorks Animation, because the film takes so long and there's so many people working on it, like I was saying earlier, before we recorded, there was a lot of management there on the schedule. And so I literally, when I was working there, I could count on my hands, the number of times I had to work overtime or stay a weekend day or anything like that over 10 years. So it's like a slightly more mature industry, and I think the way that they do things is different. Now, if you were in live action, if you're working at ILM or something like that doing effects, I think those hours are a lot worse. But I always said to myself that I wanted to go back into games. And if I ever could, I would do it for myself. But at the time, to buy like a PlayStation tool, like a dev kit was like 20 grand. You needed office space and all these things. And actually I had a friend who had left Rainbow halfway in between and tried to start a company and did the brick and mortar thing with all the dev kits and all that stuff. And it was just crushing. And I knew that's why I couldn't do it. And then when my friend told me, like, XNA was a thing and XBLA and you could, like, use the retail kit as a dev kit, which was kind of true, I was like, oh my God. Like, the era of the garage, like, developer is upon us. Except the tools are better, so it's, like, easier. So I was like, oh my God. And then I was like, I started saving money. And I was like, I'm going to quit my job. And I'm going to make games again. And then I did.
So when you were working in film, it was as a direct kind of reaction to what video games were like. It wasn't, or did you also want to make film? Like,
when I'm so lucky that when I was in high school, I remember my dad asking me what I wanted to do, and I had like incredibly typical, I feel like, like adolescent male, like, I want to make video games and movies. Or I guess it's not even an adolescent male, it's just like an adolescent, right? Just like, movies are cool, video games are cool, I'll just do that, right? And like, nobody told me I couldn't. My dad's like super practical, so he was just like, okay, well, you're gonna learn how to program then, and like all this stuff, But yeah, so then I went and I majored computer graphics, and then I was gonna go into one or the other. And out of school, 2 jobs that I was offered. One was Sony. After graduating computer science, what, I can't even remember. What is it when you get, like, I don't know, really high GPA, like something or other? Valedictorian? Not valedictorian. Yeah, right? Maintaining in this certain upper echelon of whatever. Sony was like, so what you can do is you can take a tape out of one machine and run it to another building and put it in another. But only for 6 months, because you got to pay your dues, right? And I was like, fuck that. I don't want to pay my dues, because Rainbow Studios is offering me a job programming video games. So that's what made the video game decision.
Okay. Yeah.
It was my arrogance to not want to spend like all this money on college and then run VHS tapes back and forth. Or beta tapes, whatever they were at the time. I don't even know.
Yeah. So you're hinting at that film was a little bit better managed than video games. Of course, it always can become a little bit of a grind too. But was there anything that major that you learned from your time at DreamWorks that you kind of then took, into your indie world and sort of carried through?
Yeah, there were a lot of things. I think at first I was really worried because I was working with another person from DreamWorks at the time when we were doing the game stuff. And I had decided the game was going to be like 2D, and he was looking at me like I was an idiot, and he was just like, dude, we've like made 3D animated films for like the last 10 years. Like, not only are we better at 3D than 2D, but like we can make them look better than most people can, And I was like, we had 400 people, buddy. Like, it's a lot harder to make it look good and under budget and all that stuff. I was like, even though I don't know 2D well, I know that I don't need a lighter, and I don't need a texture artist, and I don't need like a modeler, and like I need one artist for that. I mean, yeah, we'll have to do sprite sheets or whatever, but like I'll figure that out, right? But I think the thing I learned the best was art direction. I think when I went, unfortunately, I feel that in a lot of schools, like, you're kind of divvied into one thing or another. You're an artist or you're an engineer, right? And so even though I worked toward artistic goals with all of my projects when I was in computer science, I mean, that was just the blind leading the blind. I was just like, I'm going to make this, whatever, but I didn't have any formal training in that. So when I got to DreamWorks, it was one of those things where I had incredibly talented art directors that would have a vision, and you could see it in, like, the mood boards and like in the reference and all this stuff. And then they would, when and it's a little not fair because when you're this close to something and you're trying to make a flag move perfectly, and then you're just like, I think that's good, and then they come by and they're like, yeah, it looks like it's moving underwater, and then you're like, oh wow, it really does look like it's moving underwater. It's not fair because they're just walking by, whereas like you've been like tweaking vertices and stuff like that. But it just showed me like how good they were at not only knowing what they wanted but expressing to you like what was wrong. And so I feel like I wouldn't have had the confidence to art direct a game if I hadn't gone through all that. And it's funny because I run into that with things like I was watching a talk at GDC, and Jake Castle was talking about like art direction and like reference and all this stuff and explaining it, and I was like, who the hell doesn't know this? Like, why am I sitting here? And then I was like, oh wait, like not everybody worked at like DreamWorks Animation for 10 years and like it was told every day at dailies that their crap looked like shit, and like you gotta like fix it, right? So it's just really funny. Like when we first started hiring people for Virus Named Tom, Holly and I, we didn't realize how much we took for granted. Just the ability to communicate. Like we were having, and everybody's a little bit different, but we were, trying to get people as cheap as we could. So these were like, people fresh out of college, right? And they just like, when you're in a professional environment, you just get much more efficient at sending emails and, like, oh, well, this task is waiting on this guy, so let me contact that guy and let him know that this task is waiting on them, Whereas like we would have these people and I'd be like, what are you working on? He'd be like, oh, what have you done this week? Nothing. Why? Oh, well, I'm waiting on so-and-so. Did you ask so-and-so for the thing? Like, oh, no. Do you want me to do that? It's like, oh, my God. Like, right? But, like, if you're not out in the working world, and stuff like that, I guess these are just things that you take for granted. So it's like a lot of those little things, I think, all add up. And so that was a real big learning experience for us when it was like, oh, hey, this is a really talented person out of school. We look at his portfolio, right? And he doesn't know any better, so we can get him cheap. But then at the end of the day, like when we try to like, email him or like have him do something, it's just like it all kind of starts to fall apart.
Yeah. So you made the decision to go indie when you went back into games. What was what was the motivating factor for that? And were you like, I want to get it back into games, or were you like, I want to be an indie game developer?
No, I wanted to get back into games, but I had been abused by games, and I don't think all game studios are like that. But I wasn't willing to find out. So I also, of course, like a lot of people, like I wanted to make my game, right? And so when I went back in, I was just like, all right, well, if I'm going to make crappy wages and work really hard, I'm going to do it for my own game rather than someone else's. Little did I know at the time how big of a difference getting a paycheck is. That's like a big deal.
Yeah.
Especially when you're like used to your salary from DreamWorks and you've got a mortgage now in the Bay Area and your life is kind of set up, like making a certain amount of money and all that stuff, and then you're not making any money, and then you're eating away at the money that you made, Who'd known, right?
Yeah.
I'm sitting here making fun of like, my intern, and they probably would have been like, Jesus, well, I would have known that, So we're all good in our different areas. Apparently, like, finances at that time wasn't my strong suit.
So one thing I wanted to talk about, which is maybe a pretty broad subject, is, San Francisco has become a difficult place for anybody to live now. I was watching this Neil deGrasse Tyson interview, and he was saying, I have the quote. He says, "We measure the success of a civilization by how well they treat their creative people." So how well do you think is San Francisco treating its creative people?
Yeah, it's tough, right? Because I feel like a lot of times people will sit there and they'll be like, well, why the hell do you live there, right? And it's this horrible push and pull, right? Like, amazingly, living in San Francisco, I have worked out of the IGN offices in the IGN Indie Open House. Mm-hmm. I have worked out of the Double Fine offices just because they're cool. like I'm sitting here talking to you right now and these fine people because of the IGDA in San Francisco, right? So it's like, it's one of these things where we all look at each other and we're like, why are we here? And it's like, well, we're here because we're here, you know? And it's like, if we could all just get up and form a commune somewhere, you know? But it's like, it's amazing because there's so many creative and interesting people here. And like, I steal all of their ideas and I put them into my games for profit. So, but is San Francisco treating us well? I don't think that, I do sometimes look at like other countries, you know, where they fund the arts and stuff like that. And I'm like, oh my God, how cool, how nice would it be to be able to, you know, ask for a grant or, you know, and stand some kind of chance of that based on what I'm doing or whatever. But yeah, I don't know. It's kind of muddy because I've got this like weird, like indoctrinated American kind of like capitalistic streak, you know, where it's just like, well, you know, if what do I want to be paid to do what I love? Like, why should other people not? Like, why is the guy who's, you know, emptying the trash tonight, you know, not able to do that or whatever? So it's kind of like, even though I kind of bemoan it, you know, I don't throw myself too many pity parties because not only have I been able to do really cool stuff, but, you know, nobody's, like other people don't get to do that. And I remember one person saying that one time. I know that people can be caustic on forums and stuff like that, especially to indies when they don't really understand. They're just like, I have two completely contrasting forum posts. One of them was like, when, like, he was literally asking, he was like, when Tim says that, like, when we make suggestions and he's like, we might not have the budget to do that and all these other things, but we'll try. He's like, what is he talking about? Isn't he an indie? Like, what budget? Like, it's like he just like works from home on this stuff. Like, what does he got to pay, you know? It's like literally to say that, and it's like, oh my God. And then, but then on the other hand, like there was a guy, and you know, there were a lot of people that were just like, no, he has to pay himself, you know, and like the people that work with him, and you know, he doesn't exempt him from paying just because he's an indie. But then there was another guy, and he was saying like, you know, someone was, you know, kind of white knighting indies and stuff like that and being like, oh, blah, blah, blah. And this other guy was like, well, look, like, I get that it's hard, but that's why I'm not doing it right now. That's why I'm at my job. I would love to be doing what you're doing, but I don't have the guts to do that. And I think that's amazing that you did that, and that's really cool. But part of the reason I don't have the guts to do it is because it's painful and because it's financially silly and all of these reasons. So it's like, keep in mind, like, you know, even though it's really tough on you or whatever, a lot of us aren't doing it because of those reasons, right? So, yeah.
So what is it like taught you about, you know, how do you run a business and stay alive and promote your product and all of that stuff that is not actually making a game?
I think, well, yeah, I've learned a lot about all that. But I think as far as business is concerned, I think one of the key mistakes that we made at the end of A Virus Named Tom was to be kind of rational. It's kind of like being a business is like a shack where like you can't stop moving, you know? Like you just have to keep going. So it's like there's like an edge right there, and you're like, that's an edge. But like you just tell your brand, no, there's a bridge. There's a bridge right there. Just keep running. It'll get there. Right? And as you're running, that bridge will start to form. And you're just like, wow, that doesn't make any sense. But it will. And like sometimes it won't, and you'll fall flat on your face, and that'll be horrible. But so far for me, that didn't happen. But like what happens is that like we got done with A Virus Named Tom, and Holly was kind of like, well, like we don't want to make another game unless we have enough money to make the next game, which makes so much logical sense. But in the industry that we're in, you just can't do that. So what I did was I started kind of working on prototypes, and then I was like, still doing the biz dev, and then we got a deal with Sony to put it on Vita, and that wasn't enough to make another game, but it was enough to keep us alive and making not only A Virus Named Tom on Vita, but then making prototypes on the side. And then we got a Humble Bundle, and then that gave us some money, and then we kept alive through that, and then we were like, oh God, like now we have some prototypes that we want to make, but we still don't have the budget to make this game. And then like right at the 11th hour, Indie Fund swoops in, and they're just like, money, and we're just like, yay. And then we made money off of all that. And like right now, like I was saying, as we got toward the end of Duskers, we have to pay them back and all this stuff. So what I was saying to Holly was, I was like, I'm assuming that we're not going to make enough money on this game to make another game. I'm assuming that I'm going to have to do some wizardry to make the next game. right? So it's going to have to be that we have a cool pitch and we go to a publisher, or we go back to Indie Fund, or we make something in VR and just get all the gobs of money being thrown around on that, you know? Like, there's, like, some way to survive, and, like, you figure that out. Yeah, rather than, like, what you would traditionally think of as, like, make game, make enough money to make next game, make next game, make enough money to make next game. It's like, no. There's a whole lot of hustling in between all that.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big difference. Like, I do think that if I saw... I think for most of us, if you told us, like, 5 years ago, like, no, you didn't, sell 1 million units, because you have to tell yourself that, otherwise you're insane, right? You have to be like, this game has the potential to blow up, right? But I don't know if any of us would do it if we, looking back, we'd have been like, if I'd have known then what I know now. But it's still fun. It's still amazing.
Yeah.
It's part of the duality of kind of running your own business, I think.
Yeah. When you think about, because there is the balance, right, of being an artist and being a businessman, and one of the things that Owen Mahoney, who's the CEO of Nexon, was saying was that in the mobile space right now, he's finding it very difficult to find anything that's, creatively original, because a lot of companies in the mobile space who are trying to get either acquired or have their products published are creating what biz dev people told them to create, which was, this product that is like this but slightly different. And so he's in a dilemma where it's like, there's nothing that I can buy now because I already have the thing that's like that thing but different.
Right.
So where do I get the original content from? And so when you think about that, and as you think about like the VR opportunities or other opportunities, VR is interesting because it's a totally brand new platform. So
right.
pretty much whatever you create is going to be original. But like, when you look at the opportunities, how do you then sort of maintain your integrity as an artist and maintain that originality, because you have Duskers is a very original game.
Right. And I think the way that I do it is, or at least the way that I try to do it, I don't know if I succeed or not, is just by being a brat. Like being an arrogant brat.
Yeah.
Like, so the way that I look at things is I can get a job. Like, I believe that I can go get a job and make money and support my family and all that stuff, right? And this is the same reaction I have when people are like, hey man, why don't you just like sell out and make like a crappy game that does microtransactions, all that stuff, make some money, and then go back to making your artsy stuff, right? Which is really funny, because I'm just like, it's not easy to make money even with a crappy, microtransaction game. Like, I mean, there are lots of players in that field that can acquire users and all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
But what I say to myself is that, like, the reason that I started doing this is because I love doing this, and I knew that there would be pain points, right? If all of a sudden I start making games that I don't think are exciting or cool or whatever, then why the hell am I doing this? Because I could be making more money doing other things and not having to worry about, like, how to fit my game into 144 characters in a clever tweet or whatever, right? Like, I don't have to worry about that stuff. The reason I'm doing this is because of that. So, like, as soon as I stop making decisions because I think this is awesome, there's no point to it. So that in itself allows me to be a selfish jerk and be like, hey, you know what? I'm going to make a game with a command line interface because that's cool. Mm-hmm. And if I'm going to worry too much, I mean, you do worry because in the back of your mind, you're like, if I make enough money, I can make another one. Like one more game. So there is that in the back of your mind. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I'd just rather make a game that I love and that I want to make than worry about all that. And I found that when I was listening to other indie devs, and even devs, like when you hear stories from like, Braid to FTL to World of Goo or whatever it is, the one thing you start to realize is that there isn't a pattern. You're just like, how did you sell your game? It's like, oh, we just kind of put it out there and people loved it. How did you sell your game? Oh, we hired this marketing company. We really paid attention to ads and all this stuff. And it's like, how did you? It's like the answers are always different, mm-hmm. right? So that frees you up to do what you want to do. Like, that's why I do what I do. Like, I'll do YouTube videos, or I'll do, I'll do Twitter or whatever, but I'm not as big on Tumblr or whatever. And the reason why is simply because I enjoy doing those more, and I feel that fits me better. So I'm just going to do a better job. I'm going to make a better video than I will a blog post. It's just part of who I am. So rather than fight that, I can see plenty of examples of people who do well making blog posts and who do well, making videos. So when someone tells you, oh, you need to do a blog post, like you need to write more blogs, I'm like, well, like there's a lot of people that don't, and they do just fine. There's a lot of people that do. So that's the beauty. At first I got frustrated. I got so frustrated with like trying to read that data and like trying to be like, what can I do to get ahead? And like, what's the right way to do things? And then when I like gave up because there was so much noise, or just accepting that anybody that knew that stuff like was, hoarding that data at a higher pay grade than me or whatever. And so like I was just stuck in my confusion land, especially with marketing and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Then all of a sudden it was just like, hey, why don't I just do the stuff that I think is cool? Mm-hmm. So like for Duskers, like we made a decision that like going to PAX with a game like A Virus Named Tom, where it's like 4 people, pick up a controller, play really fast, like funny, it was perfect for PAX, and it was like amazing. Duskers, I could just picture myself there and be like, here are your headphones, go in the back room, like come out in 45 minutes, tell me what you like, we can roll through maybe like 10 of you today. It's going to be totally worth the trip to Seattle and all this booth space, right? So we didn't do that. And I was just like, what's cool about this game is the atmosphere and all that stuff, so we made more trailers. Mm-hmm. Like I made 2 teasers and a full trailer, and I actually had Marlon Weeby helped me out, and that I took the PAX money and I put it there. On my next game, it might be a better PAX game or whatever. And now I'm just kind of like, I just do it by gut. It's more fun. I think the result is almost the same. And it's way less stressful.
Yeah. So let's talk about the future more specifically. What is exactly do you think you have in mind for maybe another game or maybe an evolution for Duskers? Because you with A Virus Named Tom, like you were saying, you had a deal with Sony and I is that something that you sort of see like as a possibility for Duskers? Or?
Yeah, when you make a game with a command line interface, the mobile publishers aren't lined up for the port. So we kind of I talked to Sony really early on. And they were interested in, getting Duskers, and I knew that maybe that's possible, but I was like, I just want to follow this command line thing to the end, because I knew as soon as I was thinking in the back of my mind, hey, just make sure that everything also works with the controller, like I wouldn't be doing it right. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I kind of doubt that we would port it to anything, just because the game is what it is. I don't think it would. I think you could do a controller version of it, maybe for console, but. I don't know. I think it would be a different game. I think at that point you would just make a different game. Yeah. So, and then we had some games that we did as prototypes before that I never quite got out of my system. There's this mashup of Chess and Magic the Gathering that I call Chess the Gathering. And I kind of want to put that out there just so I can get sued. But that's a game, that's another, that I don't know. It's kind of funny because Holly is kind of in love with what we were able to do with Duskers. And she sees like, a purely tactical like board game like that. She's like more interested in like exploring that space. Mm-hmm. And so for right now, she's also a little bit burnt out on the whole like roller coaster that is indie game development. Mm-hmm. So right now the thought, I'm debating what to do. We can either, we might take a break, and before that break, I'm so bad. I'm like, just relax, man. But no, it's like before that break, we could either like work a little bit more on Duskers and do a few more things to that, or we could try to get Chess the Gathering just to a point where I could put it out there and just be like, it's just $5, $10. It's not beautiful, and I'm not spending tons of time on polish. Or I could start working on a couple ideas that I have that might turn into the eventual game that's like Duskers, or our next kind of more atmospheric, more, weird, whatever I come up with kind of game. And that might also be a good reason to take like a quick break, because it might be that like, instead of having the pressure, because at first I was like, oh, I've got to think of something, and I was like, if I could make it like Duskers, we could reuse some stuff, and we could do it faster, and then maybe we could afford to do this and that and the other thing. And I think that sometimes when you constraints are good, but when you're like, okay, we got to come up with our prototype in like the next 2 weeks and like implement it and stuff like that, that's not always where the best ideas come from. Right. I think that Duskers resonates so much with people, and it has had such critical success because it baked. Right. And because we were lucky that like this weird meandering path led somewhere.
Right.
So I don't know. And that's the way you would want to do it in an ideal world, like where you're like, hey, I'm doing this because I love it. So I'm going to like, if I'm going to spend, I would love to be like, you know what, next game we're just going to spend a year on or a year and a half. But like, it just seems so unrealistic. It's like, I haven't been able to do it. Like my last 2 games, I've definitely taken a while. So
the world of Duskers is so compelling. Have you thought about creating another game that's within that?
That would be pretty cool.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting world. I think that A Virus Named Tom, the story was just this dark humor, and it was my way of just doing these little like short animations, which was really fun. But Duskers, we actually wrote. So one of my favorite things on Duskers, because I love writing, and especially with a partner. And so when I would, because Ben is in England, and so like his night was my morning, so it's like it was always my first kind of thing in the morning would be to just bullshit with him for an hour about story, which is just so fun, and then be like, okay, you go write cool things about that. It's like the best part of writing is it's like the ideation, right, and like coming up with stuff and be like, oh yeah, that'll connect to this and like all this stuff, and then when I have to sit down and create the prose, it's just like, I'm going to go get a bagel, like, and you sit down for like 2 seconds and be like, I got to go to the bathroom, I just can't do it. So then to just be like, okay, you do that.
Yeah.
That was like perfect. But to be able to extend that, and we had like another storyline, like a backbone storyline that was really weird and interesting in the game. And so to be able to explore that more would be fun. Because in the game right now, we do a lot, just like the player story and all that stuff, like we can't tell you exactly everything, because it's like we've got to leave some things up. So there's a lot left unsaid in that story. And so that would be really cool.
That'd be cool. You heard it here first. All right, cool. So are there any questions? Yes.
What are the, I guess, not necessarily publishing opportunities, but what are the kind of partnership opportunities that you see these days? Because you said for A Virus Same Time you got a deal with Sony for Vita, but I don't know if Sony does that kind of thing now anymore.
So it's all about, so it depends on where you're coming from. So if you're coming from big first party kind of stuff like Sony, Microsoft, and big companies, usually they have initiatives, right? So it's like right now, they're like Sony, for example, it would be PlayStation VR probably, right? Or at the time that I happened to be coming out with A Virus Named Tom, they had PlayStation Mobile, which was a new way that they were doing things on the Vita. And so what happens is they'll come up with something new, or they'll have a new thing, and they're like, okay, we're going to try this, and we're going to put some muscle behind it, right? And that's when you can kind of jump on that wave and be like, I have content, that you need for this thing. So usually that's really nice. Sometimes it can be painful, because if it's new hardware, new ways of doing things, you're going to have to go through their iterations while they're doing it and realize that it doesn't support video or whatever. So there's bumps along the way, but usually with that's where you go. If you're looking at traditional publishing and stuff like that, then it's seeking out publishers that are right for you. When we did A Virus Named Tom, I didn't know anything about anything. I don't think a lot of people did. There was a lot of shifting things back then, but I went to what I was assuming, because I was thinking console. And I had worked in AAA. So, I was going to the Capcoms and Ubisofts, and, I was going to those types of publishers. And those types of publishers, I don't feel understood indies. They just kind of look at you and be like, poke at you and be like, what is this? I even made this little puppet video about all my pitches. And the things that I put in that puppet video were all true. They were all experiences that I had. Well, I exaggerated some of them, of course, but they were all based on exact experiences pitching to these guys. So when Duskers came around, I and I mean, maybe, again, this is like an arrogant thing, but I was like, I'm not going to bother pitching to a bunch of companies. If I don't hear from a fellow independent game developer that they're working with you and that relationship has been working, I wasn't going to bother. And, I don't have many friends, so that limited the pool incredibly. So I think I only pitched Duskers to Indie Fund, which was that, like, oh yeah, that's going to work, right? Like, I'll just be like, yeah, Adult Swim and Devolver, I think, because Alex Austin was working with Devolver Digital on Sub Rosa, and like Alex seemed like the last person that would ever work with a publisher, so I was like, wow, that's amazing, and I had known some people that were working with Adult Swim, and that had been really cool, and so I limited my options that way. But those guys are looking for good content, and so like and they're always, it's not like back in the day when like you had to like know a guy that knew a guy that had the phone number or whatever. Like now they're looking for content. They're around at GDC and all that stuff, and if you just ask, like I think back in the day people also too, they would be like, I don't want to give you my contacts, and you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like I will totally tell you that Steve Gee at Adult Swim Games is awesome, and that like I will give you his email, and and that Nigel at Devolver is awesome too, and I will give you his email. Alex is pretty good. He looks, he's got a DAPA hat right there. He might be looking to invest in things, so I got his email.
Well, yeah, someone told me someone told me that you had to like, the Devolver wouldn't even, it was either Devolver or Tiny Builder. One of them was like, if you haven't met them in person, they won't even respond to your email. Even if you have a good game or whatever, they're not going to deal with you.
Yeah, I don't think that's true. I have no idea though. Because I was like, I didn't know them at all, and because Alex had to deal with them, I was like, hey man, like, are they going to be at GDC? I'd love to show them Duskers, and that's how that got set up. Mm-hmm. So.
Well, if you didn't, but
you
saw them in person, you just sent them a blind email. Like,
no, yeah. So I went through Alex.
Okay.
But that was just because he was sitting next to me. But like, yes, so my experience is I'm sitting on my ivory throne of privilege here. I guess that could be true. I know that's definitely not true.
That's basically what someone told me. Like, you need to know somebody who has direct contact with the people.
Yeah, I don't know. That would be interesting. So maybe I'll give you Nigel's email and you can tell me if that's true.
Okay. If they have a booth at GDC, then I'm guessing it's there for people to walk up to say, hey.
They weren't at GDC. I was there.
Devolver wasn't?
You had to go to they had a building rented out. Oh. They weren't at GDC. They were in San Francisco.
Right.
But they were only there for like Monday or something.
Another thing that kind of happens sometimes is, especially around GDC, if you're trying to line up pitches with publishers, like they're slammed, right? Because like every developer in the country is like in town for like a number of days. So like, I found what I found was ironic. I remember this. I was gonna go pitch Ubisoft back in the day, and like I was having a little bit of trouble setting things up. And so then I just contacted one of them and I was like, I'll be around during GDC, because they're so used to everyone being around during GDC. And they're just like, okay, write you in. I live here. They're here. I was working at the IGN offices at the time. I was like 2 doors down, but I was like, I'm going to be in town for GDC. And then after that, I was like, GDC is going to be kind of crazy. Like, why don't we meet up like before or after that? And they were like, oh, you're in the area? Oh, fine, But it's almost like I had to activate their brain of like, yes, schedule. So, like, sometimes when you try to do that with publishers, it can be like, hey, like, let's follow up after, or let me send you my thing before, or something like that. Especially if you book late. I think it's kind of like one of those things where you should really, like, at least a month in advance, you should be, contacting if you want to talk to press, or you're going to talk to press. I have no idea how to talk to press at GDC.
Yes, sir.
So, yeah, I have a question. What about Duskers would you have done differently?
That is a really good question. I don't know if I've ever been asked that question. That seems like one of those like interview questions, and I am completely unprepared for that. I would like to say that there were some systems in Duskers that were brittle because we constantly had the mentality of, let's just prototype it. I'm not sure if this design decision is a good one. Just throw it in there as fast as you can, and if it's really good, and we end up keeping it, we'll refactor it and we'll work it in correctly. And we never had time to go back there. But I guess I really couldn't honestly say that, because I could only say that if at the end of development I was like, oh, we have extra time. and like we never do, right? Like I would have crammed more and more stuff in, so it's just kind of like the nature of the beast that like you just don't have time to do that. So that was my only answer, and that wasn't a good one.
Works for me.
Yeah.
So, did you get a publisher then at the end, or?
Yeah, so Indie Fund came in and funded us. And it was right when Indie Fund was transitioning. So Indie Fund used to be that there were 7 people, and they were kind of like a unanimous vote, you know? And when I was coming in, they were starting to do more and more like Indie Fund plus plus, as I called it, where different people that had done well enough that they can invest in other games and wanted to kind of pay it back or whatever, would get involved. And so I was funded that way just as that was becoming Indie Fund. So at the very beginning, Indie Fund kind of said no, because it was a really weird game. The prototype I had was very early. It was like boxes in space. It was boxes with headlights, cubes with headlights, and my ask was kind of big for an indie. So like those were at two ends of the thing, right? And but then some of them really liked it, and so it kind of became this thing. It was really funny because it was like they told me, what did they tell me? They were like, you know what, like we're not going to fund it, but if this chunk will mean the difference between you making and not making Duskers, then we will come in and give you this amount. At which point I was like, awesome. Now I just got to go to my Rolodex of rich people. And I was like, I don't have, and I was like, wait a minute, I was in a Humble Bundle. Let's go talk to them. So I went and talked to Jeff and John, actually just Jeff. And he was like, this is really cool. Like, if you get other people to go in on this, I'll chip in. And then I was out. That was my whole Rolodex. So then I went back to Indie Fund. And I'm like, so you guys and Jeff. And then Ron Carmel was like, I actually got an offer from a publisher. And I was like, hey guys, like I know that, you know, whatever, but like, you know, I don't have like, and at that point Ron was just like, because he was a big proponent of the game. He loved it. And so he was like, all right, like, you know, let me see if I can, you know, whatever. And like within like a few hours, like I was getting like emails from like Cliff Harris and like Tommy Reffinis being like, do you have like a budget and all that stuff? I'm like, yeah, I do. I'm like creator of awesome games. Yes, I do. And then within 24 hours, like Ron was just like, okay, we have enough money. I was like, we just have enough money? He's like, yeah. And I'm like, oh, well, that's awesome. Like, I'll just make a game.
It sounds like they are more like a VC or an investor.
Now they are.
Providing also more like kind of, you know, like marketing or other services.
Right, so now the thing is, so the people on my, that gave me money, like a lot of them, most of them were not traditional Indie Fund members, right? Like Tommy Reffinis and Cliff Harris were not part of it. Sarah and Colin Northway, Zach Gage, Jeff and John, John Graham and Jeff Rosen, those were all, and then Ron and Kelly and Aaron, who are part of Indie Fund, also chipped in their own money, in addition to the chunk that Indie Fund was willing to give. Yeah, so, and I think that's really cool because I think that allows a larger range of games to be made, right? Because I think that Duskers is that strange game that like maybe some people on Indie Fund didn't either believe or weren't interested in, and others were. And so then when you widen that net, all of a sudden there were a lot of people that did. And that was really cool because I remember talking to the Armello guys because they also got indie funded, and we only shared one investor. And that was really cool because it's like they're very different games. Theirs is like, you know, kind of like an animated board game action kind of thing, and mine is like this space roguelike command line interface thing, right? And like those games, not that Indie Fund didn't have a variety of things, but it makes sense that if you have more people investing, you can fund more things and have a greater variety of things. So I certainly benefited from that. So I think it's cool.
The February IGDA event here, the Indie Fund was brought up as well. You asked about Jonathan Blow, whether he thought that Indie Fund was still useful or something along those lines, and it sounded like he was a little hesitant. Do you have any thoughts on whether you think that Indie Fund is still a useful thing to have exist?
I think it's incredibly useful. I think it's almost more useful in its current state, that it could, like, more people can do that. Like, I mean, I know me, myself, and I, if Duskers had blown up and made, you know, mega bucks, that I would, at that point, be like, I want to invest, right? And it was interesting because I remember when Holly's a little bit more, a little bit sharper than me at certain points, and I remember when we were getting investment, it's a lot like when people would like early versions of a prototype. She'd always be like, ask them where they heard about it. Ask them why they like it. You know, like, these are important things to know. And so when I was getting investment, she was just like, have you asked any of them, like, why they're investing? I'm like, no. And she's like, ask. And at that time, like, Tommy Refiniz had, you know, had said that he would invest or whatever. And I was like, why did you invest? And he was like, well, he's like, there's kind of two things. He's like, one is if I want to see a game made, and another is if I think a game can make money. And it was, like, flattering because he was like, I think Duskers is both. But that was really telling to me. Unlike, you know, traditional VCs and stuff, I do think that a lot of those guys, I mean, they certainly want to make money, but I also think they really love and care about games, and they want to see cool games get made. And so that's kind of, it's a little bit comforting. You definitely do feel this weight on you. Like, I feel in a weird way if it was just some megacorp, you know, that had invested in me, that had, like, tons of money and stuff like that, you know, and it wasn't, like, Sarah and Colin Northway, who have, like, you know, like, hung out with and love, and they're amazing people, you know, I would be like, if the game makes money or not, it doesn't matter. Because it's like, you know, that's a faceless entity. So I do feel this pressure that I certainly want to make them back their money, but I at the same point in time, they feel more human to me, and I feel like they would understand if it's like, oh, we made this great thing. Like, look at all the people this connected with, and it didn't make a ton of money, right? Like, I feel like they might still... I don't know. They might still be like, all right, that was cool. You know? I don't know.
Yeah, I think what Jonathan was saying too was that when he started Indie Fund, things like Kickstarter didn't exist.
Yeah, that's true.
And so he, was that something that would appeal to you for maybe next time?
So I always say that I'm going to kickstart something, and I never do.
Yeah.
And I think the appeal is, like, right now, like, my money is going to Indie Fund because I have to pay them back. And then when I pay them back, they take a percentage for their risk and stuff like that, and it all makes sense. But that means that, you know, if I had kickstarted, then I give everybody the copies of the game, and I'd be taking all the money right now, and then I'd be like, woohoo, next game. So that's the appeal of it. And, of course, it just petrifies me, even though, I don't know, like, it's just like putting all that work into essentially what's like a launch, and then, you know, it could not work out. Mm-hmm. Like, that's just really tough on me, especially when the game is early and all that stuff. Like, and so, like, I'm always, like, with my community, I'm like, hey, guys, like, I even had a vote, like, which one do you want to make, because I'm going to kickstart, with, you know, and all this stuff. Mm. And then always just like, I'd rather owe a bunch of money than have to deal with Kickstarter. Right. And I think there are better ways to do Kickstarter, and I think maybe now that I've, you know, made some games that people have really liked, like, I can, you know, have some more visibility with that and stuff like that, so that's, like, a possibility. Yeah. But yeah, I always say that I will, and I never do.
Cool. Any other questions? Yeah, one more.
I was wondering if, like, Duskers is a game you could have made, like, as your first game. Like, if Duskers was your first game and, like, you hadn't made a virus named Tom yet,
mm-hmm.
like, if you would have, like, made the same kind of decisions that you did for, like, this game rather than, like, your first game.
I wouldn't. So, A Virus Named Tom, ironically, I love that game. But it was ironic the way that came about, because I was working on a different game with other people from Dreamworks, actually. And what happened is that it became clear to me that we weren't going to finish. Like, the scope that we were making, like, a puzzle game, and, like, they were going to have, like, this epic story, and, like, all this, like, you know, we were going to use Unreal to, you know, like, do all these crazy, like, animations and all this stuff. And I was just like, no, this is like, let's scope it, you know? And so I kind of had to give that up because I was taking a 3-month sabbatical from DreamWorks, and I decided I was going to test out this whole game making thing and see if I could do that. And so I was halfway through that when I realized that this was never going to get made, and I had to abandon that. And at the time, I was like, you know, during these 3 months, I'm going to make a game, which is like what everyone thinks, I think, when they're in indie, right? And so A Virus Named Tom was born out of, hey, I have these mechanics, and I've got this game. Like, is there something I can do with that and finish it in 6 weeks? And that's where that was born. So that wasn't like this game that was always ruminating in the back of my mind. And I'm like, I got to make this game, right? So that's why that game was as it was. And I love how it turned out, but I don't think it was necessarily like a game that I had always thought of. So that's one reason. But the other reason is that I wouldn't have been able to make a game of the scope of Duskers because I wouldn't have been able, I don't feel like I would have been able to be indie funded. Like I feel like I had no, I would have no reputation. I would not be able to show that I've finished a game, you know? And I also, so I wouldn't have had the budget for it because we did all savings for A Virus Named Tom. And even though it ended up being a much bigger game than I intended it to be, it was still a smaller game than Duskers. So what I like to think of is I almost spent the same amount of time making the games. I feel like no matter what I will make, it'll take me 3 years to make a video game. It's just that the game will be a little bit bigger, and I try not to do that, but I fall for that. So that's kind of what happened with Duskers. But yes, I don't think that I would have been able to make Duskers simply from, and I don't know, maybe I grew as a designer and an art director and all that stuff too, but I don't think I would have been able to make it sheerly from a funding standpoint.
You want to go get a beer?
Yes.
All right. Great. Thank you so much, Tim.
Thank you.
This would be safe.